Hello, everybody. Greetings from Ankara, the capital of Turkey, to all professors, scholars, and students who are watching us. This is the third episode of our Orientalism webinar series organized by the Social Sciences University of Ankara, Turkey, or ASBÜ, as we say in Turkish. I'm Filiz Barınakman, Associate Professor of English Language and Literature. I am also the Vice and Acting Chair, English Language and Literature Department. Now, before I start, I would like to give you brief information about our series. Orientalism Webinar Series is a series of online lectures, each of which will host a world-famous distinguished speaker on a related field with Orientalism and postcolonialism. In each webinar session, a speaker will give you a 30 or 40 minutes talk on a topic about their scholarship, followed by a 15-minute question and answer session. During the talk, please send your questions to asbuows@gmail.com. In this series, our aim is to give an opportunity to students and scholars from around the world to become familiar with the trailblazing and cutting-edge scholarship of internationally acclaimed academics on critical theories of Orientalism and postcolonialism. Related issues to be discussed include the image of the other, namely the East, Islam and the Turks in Western discourse, and Islamophobia, cross-cultural interactions and encounters between East and West in the historical contexts of the Renaissance and beyond, as well as pedagogical issues and topics related to these fields of study. With the gracious contributions of these important scholars, we hope to inspire more emerging students and scholars to see the rich possibilities of potential research topics in these significant area studies with necessary updates. So it is an absolute honor and privilege for me to introduce to you today's speaker, Professor Hatem Bazian from the University of California, Berkeley and Zeytuna College. His talk is titled An Assessment and the Challenges in the Islamophobia Studies Field. I'm gonna read through his biography. Dr. Hatem Bazian is a co-founder and professor of Islamic law and theology at Zeytuna College, the first accredited Muslim liberal arts college in the United States. In addition, Professor Bazian is a lecturer in the departments of Near Eastern and Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Bazian, between 2002 and 2007, also served as an adjunct professor of law Walt Hall School of Law at the University of California, Berkeley. He teaches courses on Islamic law and society, Islam in America, communities and institutions, deconstructing Islamophobia and othering of Islam, religious studies and Middle Eastern studies. In addition to Berkeley, Professor Bazian served as a visiting professor in religious studies at St. Mary's College of California between 2001 and 2007. And he was advisor to the Religion, Politics, and Globalization Center at, again, Berkeley. In spring 2009, Professor Bazian founded at Berkeley the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at the Center for Race and Gender, a research unit dedicated to the systematic study of othering Islam and Muslims. Professor Bazian in spring 2012 launched the Islamophobia Studies Journal, which is published biannually through a collaborative effort between the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project of the Center for Race and Gender at the University of California at Berkeley, the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas Initiative for the School of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University, the Center for Islamic Studies at the Graduate Theological Union, the International Center for Muslim and Non-Muslim Understanding at the University of South Australia, and Zeytuna College. In addition to academic work, Dr. Bazian is a weekly columnist for the Turkish daily Sabah newspaper in Turkey and a Turkey Agenda online magazine. Dr. Bazian is also founder and national chair of American Muslims for Palestine, board member of the Islamic Scholarship Fund, Muslim Legal Fund of America, president of Dollar for Deen Charity, and chair of Northern California Islamic Council. Wow, you have done a lot. All right, as his works and academic pursuits attest, Dr. Bazian is following in the path that was bravely laid out for today's academics by Edward Said. As we all know, Said's groundbreaking works on Orientalism helped direct our attention to the issues of representation and the other, and still relevant to us, including the Turks, the Arabs, and other Muslims, as well as colonized peoples. One of the important topics Said wrote about was the West's relations with the Islamic other. In his academic works, especially in Covering Islam, How the Media and Experts Determine How We See the Rest of the World, which was published in 1997, Said detected an underlying current of Islamophobia, which determined the nature and form of West's coverage of Islamic world and the Muslim other. Accordingly, in these media representations, Islam was, almost with no exception, associated with terrorism and barbarity. This language obviously led to injustice in the form of occupations, deportations, and wars, and misunderstanding as well as misrepresentations between the East and the West. Said knew that one part of the solution to these problems would be identification and realization of the problem of Islamophobia. The other part then would be, through academic endeavors, through arts, for instance, through literary production, through literature, or speaking truth to power, and foregrounding of decolonial thought, as Professor Bazian suggests in his book, Annotations on Race. This is challenging. This means challenging the dominant Orientalist discourse by disseminating correct information and giving a voice to the silenced or the misrepresented. And Professor Bazian's academic works accomplish all these. So Professor, today it's an exceptional honor for me to welcome you in Orientalism webinar series as a speaker who is continuing the academic tradition of Edward Said. Once more, I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your time and expertise, Prof. So the floor, well, I should say the screen is all yours. And after you are done with your talk and lecture, I'm going to join back to the discussion for some questions to address to you. Thank you, Professor.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you, Dr. Feliz, and thank you, Dr. Bazian, for the invitation to really address an important subject in this series on Orientalism. I think Edward Said's work is still as relevant today as the moment that he put it out in circulation. Both the field of post-colonial studies and also the move possibly toward decolonization is an important subject, both academically, but also for those who are concerned about the circumstances and the conditions befalling the global South. I prepared a presentation that I will share, and hopefully this will spark some of the questions as we move forward in this discussion of ours. Now, when we think about the subject of Islamophobia and how we actually relate to the phenomena, we need to think about what is it that is generating this intense hostilities toward Islam and Muslims, and to try to do an assessment of the field. Just past year, it became apparent to us that the data collection from the apps was being funneled and actually taken by security agencies. So in here we have one of the most widely used apps that Muslims use for their prayers, and the US military, and my assumption also is other militaries and intelligence services, were accessing that data under the rubric that the Muslim prayer app can be a window to try to identify and find this access and find, individuals that might be intent on terrorism. Not only prayer apps, but also social networking in terms of dating or marriage apps for Muslims likewise were accessed. And this was falling into this national security and securitization of the Muslim subject overall. So this just points to one of the persistent problems of the targeting and the surveillance of Muslim subjects in all settings. And I will get into the different zones, which I consider to be different zones of Islamophobia in different zones of engagement.
Professor, as you pause here for a second, Professor, sure. Can I ask you to, push on the button which sort of like starts your PowerPoint presentation? Because right now we see the whole thing. So
can you see it right now? Maybe it's just like my side is not getting. Are you able to see the presentation now?
Yeah, we are actually able to see this, but we see the whole PowerPoint. Like if you press on begin the slide and begin the presentation button, we will just see the pages, not the, not everything else. Does this
Are you seeing it right now? Are you seeing the change in the
pages?
Yes,
we can see this, but we see the whole thing, like also the PowerPoint, background and everything. So if you just click on, let's say, start the slide section.
I'm doing that.
Yes, and that's the button. Yeah.
And are you seeing the shift in slides?
Maybe it's gonna take a little bit of time because we are sort of like having a poor connection and some problems with the connection. So you have pushed on the start the slideshow button, right?
I did.
Okay. So looks like this is all what we are going to have. So I don't want to disrupt you further. All right.
I'll just go with my own face and just go through and just do my presentation. And
okay, however you like, Professor. So yeah. Sorry to bother and sorry to disturb you. Okay, so
no, that's okay. I think we want to get as much benefit as possible. Yeah. Again, starting with this targeting of the Muslim subject. Just a few weeks back, we just released a survey of the Muslim community in the United States and Canada, about 1,614 participants. We asked individuals, as a Muslim, I feel Islamophobia is taken seriously by civil society, corporate, and political leadership. 52% disagreed, and 39% strongly disagreed, which basically says that 80% of our respondents feel that civil society, corporate leadership, and political leadership in the West is not taking Islamophobia seriously, which is a phenomena that is already pervasive within the society. A second question that we asked for individuals is said, as a Muslim living in the West, North America, and also Europe, I feel more. And this was one of the shocking findings. It said, I feel strongly insecure and afraid for my family and kids. That's 30%. And somewhat insecure and afraid for my family and kids, about 49%. So literally 80% of the respondents, Muslim respondents, are feeling insecure for family and kids. And this is at a time where we have a heightened crisis of insecurity for the community that is basically affecting how Muslims are being perceived and how they're being at least targeted within the society. So this again shows the type and the extent of Islamophobia that we are facing in the United States and in the West. Now, taking us back a little bit, Frantz Fanon's work is still very important in relations to the discussion, The Wretched of the Earth, and then Black Skin, White Masks. And this is to place it within the broader work of racialization, racial discourse, and also what Edward Said wrote about both on Orientalism, covering Islam, the question of Palestine, culture and imperialism. Even though that Fanon did not use the term Islamophobia per se, but the Wretched of the Earth was actually constructed around the Muslim subject in Algeria, and how the French colonization and the otherization structure that was operable. So in here, we could make an immediate link between the work of Fanon and the field of Islamophobia studies, so as not to think, as often the case, that people think that Islamophobia begins with 9/11, which really is not the case. There is a much longer history for it. Actually, the term itself, Islamophobia, emerges in the French context around 1910, specifically dealing with the French treatment of Muslims in North Africa, and the translation at the time, feeling inimical toward Islam. So we have a considerable engagement of the French, then you also the British and others in relations to otherization, demonization, and the targeting of the Muslim subject. If we think about anti-Arab and Islamophobia and public discourse, we definitely see that in the Six-Day War, a heavy load of anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian discourses. The Iranian Revolution likewise has a strong usage of Islamophobic discourse. The oil embargo of 1973, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, and Western support for jihad against communism, which also had a positive view of Muslims, but also problematizing Islam in relations to the Iranian Revolution. So you can have almost a dual, both a positive and a negative construct during that same period. Now, I want to define Islamophobia from what I consider to be through an ethnic studies and decolonial lens. And Islamophobia is a structural organizing device positioned at the present racial, gender, and class crossroads, is employed to rationalize and extend the dominant global power hierarchies while working on a project for silencing the collective global other. Now, this is important in terms of locating Islamophobia within the whole discourse of racialization, but also global North, global South dynamics. So we don't get only in terms of, for example, some would approach Islamophobia from that we're dealing with immigrant integration and assimilation, or that people have an ignorant understanding of Islam. While these can be issues to deal with, but in essence, what we're dealing is this structural aspect, especially post-Cold War, where the West was searching a new enemy to rationalize its own continued hegemonic discourse globally. And I will get to that later on. At one level, its ideologues attempt to classify who belongs to the civilized world and the criterion for membership, and who is the demonized and ostracized global other. But at a deeper level, it's a rationalization for the existing domestic and global racial stratification, economic power hierarchies, and open-ended militarism. Islamophobia constructs a singular and homogeneous, undifferentiated image of Muslim men and women, which presents all as religious fanatics, violent, and antithetical to civilization itself. So again, this is very important for us to locate the understanding and definition of Islamophobia. Now, questions for all those in the Islamophobia studies field. What period should be included to theorize the beginning of Islamophobia discourses? So if you read Edward Said, again, in terms of the constructing of the image, Orientalism dated to the French colonial campaign on Egypt in 1798, where it was also the French came to document Egypt and in essence begin to have the good Muslim, bad Muslim framing And Edward Said puts that as a period of the otherization and the development of the stereotypical image of Muslims. But there are others that actually take it in much earlier, during the colonial period, at an earlier stage, dating back possibly to also 1492, the expulsions of Muslims and Jews from Europe, where this otherization, both on a religious identity, but also the emergence of racial discourse. Some would also date it to maybe the pre-1492 period, to the Crusades, where Pope Urban II's speech that spoke of Muslims as being a cursed race or a cursed community, that begins to the whole structure of otherization as well. And then some will try to take it all the way to the early formation of Islam itself and the writing of some of the Christians in Damascus at that time. But these are, again, theoretical foundations in relations to how to locate the beginning of this field. And therefore, are pre-20th century anti-Muslim discourses reflective of Islamophobia, or should the term be applied only to this period? So again, in this sense, should we narrow to this current period, or to speak about pre-Islamophobic period in this sense? What are the relationship between earlier anti-Muslim expressions and the current understandings of the challenges facing us in the field? So, for example, the term Muhammadan, Saracens, and then in European discourse, the term the Turk was used as a derogatory term to describe Muslims. And as such, this shift in use of terminology is still rooted in a structure of otherization. How is Said's work on Orientalism connected to the Islamophobia studies field? These are important questions for us. And again, all of us who are contributing to the fields are still trying to connect to it. Maybe I could add another dimension, is that which specialization or department should Islamophobia be studied in? Many times in the West, that they locate or try to have a study of Islamophobia in Middle East studies, and therefore is seen as a function of Middle East political structure. And this, while some might say it's positive, I think it's problematic, because it looks at it only solely from a narrow construct of political dynamics relative to the Middle East, rather than on the whole structure and epistemology that emerges from Eurocentric discourse, that is structures of racializations that is there, and therefore there is a challenge as well in this. So these are questions for us to have, and I would welcome both people's comments and feedback on this, but these are very important as we enter into the field. In the United States in particular, contrary to popular opinion that thinks 9/11 is the watershed moment, actually the Iran hostage crisis of post-1979 Iranian revolution is very, very critical. The program Nightline, or ABC Nightline, a news program featuring Ted Koppel as its main anchor from March 1980 until his retirement in November 2005. So you're talking about almost 25 years of production. The program was one of the most successful programs. It owed its initial success to the focus on the hostage crisis, and Ted Koppel starting his nightly program with the number of days that American hostages are being held by Iran. In 2002, Nightline was ranked 23rd on TV Guide's 50 greatest TV shows of all time. Islamophobia became a commodity in the newsroom, beginning with the 1979 revolution. And it's also Edward Said wrote his book covering Islam specifically as an outcome or as one of the main aspects of the 1979 Iranian revolution and the hostage crisis. In the UK context, we have the Salman Rushdie crisis, In 1988, Salman Rushdie is publishing Satanic Verses, and Ruhollah Khomeini, the leader of the Iranian Revolution, issuing a fatwa calling for his death. The book was banned in a number of countries, including India, calling it hate speech directed toward a specific religious group. UK and Iranian relations and Islam became a focal point. And it's interesting that that generated the discussions about the position status of Muslims within the UK context. So again, this is pre 9/11, and it's not something that we only could say 9/11 was the point of demarcation. Many of us in the field understand that the Rumi Trust report of 1997, Islamophobia, a challenge for us all. The report came in the aftermath of the Salman Rushdie's crisis and the Iranian Revolution as well, but also followed on the footstep of the Rumi Trust issuing a report on anti-Semitism. So as anti-Semitism was at least documented and put in the context of public policy, it's followed by a report on the status and conditions of Islam and Muslims within the UK. And this takes us back again. Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia have a long connection relative to European discourse, going back to the expulsion of Muslims and Jews from Europe. And Europe have always had the crisis of living with the other, and their most favorable solution is to actually expel, transfer, move the other from their mix. So the challenge is on Europe rather than on those who are coming to Europe or been part of Europe for the longest period of time. I think the Rumi Trust visual summary is still, I think, important. It could be expanded, but looking at prejudice, discrimination, exclusion, and violence, I think these are four clusters that continues to be relevant as the policies in many countries, especially I think France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Austria, and then also we think of Canada as well as the United States. All these are elements that are still as relevant today in relations to Islamophobia. Now, I developed what I call the four distinctive zones of Islamophobia, that not every element of Islamophobia is the same, meaning that we have Islamophobia is articulated differently in different zones. So the first zone that I look at is North America and Western Europe. They're not by any means all identical, but in general, Islamophobia take on an institutional framework, government racialization programs, security and surveillance, and inferior citizenship status for Muslims. So whether we speak about France with the hijab or the closing of mosques and institutions, and problematizing the Muslims as being separatist in relations to France. Similar in terms of Austria, the changes in their regulations relative to the position of Islam and Muslims. Quebec, likewise, in relations to the hijab. The UK with its Prevent program that surveil and try to target Muslims in schooling, in civil society. The United States, CVE, Countering Violent Extremism. All these are what I call the North America and Western Europe zone of Islamophobia that is distinct from the other. The second zone is what I call India, China, Kashmir, Burma, Islamophobia, genocide zone. These are areas where actually genocide is underway, whether it's in actually being already recognized in terms of Burma, or in terms of the Uyghur in China, or the increasing genocide watch in Kashmir and parts of India. So this is a genocide zone relative to Islamophobia, and the clusters of issues are different than the first zone. They might have similar type of government institutional policies, but the level of violence that is being committed and the type of otherization is a little bit different than the first zone. The third zone is what I call Muslim majority state zone, where Islamophobia is deployed in the service of protecting and guarding the secular modern nation state, or framing the good Muslim or good Islam versus bad Islam. And so that also a zone that has to be understood. It has a different type of dynamics in it, and has to be approached and theorized differently, because sometimes often we have, let's say, sectarian conflicts that are there that have a long history in Islamic tradition. Can we use the term Islamophobia on the sectarian conflicts, or should we understand it differently? More importantly, the problematizing of political Islam in the current dynamics in the region, both in the Western world relations with Muslim majority states, and how political Islam becomes a way to use Islamophobia by trying to say that Muslim political agency is suspect, if not actually seen as an agency or a site of terrorism, which is increasingly what is being put forth in terms of the dynamics in Muslim majority states. So that's, again, it's a zone that is different than the other two. And the fourth zone is what I call media, social media image production. And Islamophobia in here is commodified, is a commodity, and deployed to drive massive profits and align with elite interests, and increasingly also is deployed as an instrument for elections and for politicians. So these are different zones that needs to be approached theoretically as well as research-wise. So the challenge for us who are engaged in the Islamophobia studies field is not to actually take the approach of one size or one theory or one structure that fits all. I think we have to be very careful and methodical in identifying the different trends. There are elements that are shared. For example, surveilling the Muslim subject is an element that is covering all the different zones. But how these surveillance mechanism develop into far more systematic policies and targeting of the Muslim subject is different. So speaking about France is different than speaking about India in relations to the Muslim subject. Now, for the experience of the Muslim, him or herself in the location, it is definitely, the impact is felt. But as a research method, it needs to be approached differently and theorized differently. Now, Edward Said's contributions to understanding Islamophobia is paramount. One cannot really approach the subject without thinking of Edward Said's work, both Orientalism, but also the other three books that are critical in this subject, covering Islam, the question of Palestine, and then cultural and imperialism. And then broadly speaking about also Edward Said, the representation of the intellectual, because Edward Said was always focused on what is the role of the intellectual. And increasingly since the US war and invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, since many of these, what I consider to be embedded intellectuals that use their pen, research, and their framing to really continue and expand hegemonic control and rationalize the US invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, which was centered on Islamophobic imaginary. I think Edward Said in Orientalism framed what we call latent Orientalism and manifest Orientalism. And I also extended this to the concept of latent Islamophobia and manifest Islamophobia. So it's not surprising that the media and media production have shifted away from the Russian as the villain in media production and literature, so on, to the Muslim as the villain. And this actually where the connection between culture and Islamophobia, culture and imperialism, and Edward Said's discourses. So Orientalism is activated through culture, and I say also Islamophobia is activated through cultural production that informs the policy because it creates the Islamophobic social imagery. Now, Edward Said was again responding and also engaging with many who were writing from an Orientalist framework. And when we speak about Orientalism as well as Islamophobia, Bernard Lewis is the dawn of Orientalism and problematizing Islam, even though that sometimes he has some positive statements here and there, but don't let the soft peddling of certain elements to Islam and Muslims with the pernicious constant problematizing of Islam as a singular category. And therefore, I think Edward Said's response and challenge to the Orientalist paradigm that was at the time led by, or at least represented by the work of Bernard Lewis, who never misses an opportunity to be Islamophobe at the time and never misses an opportunity to support hegemonic militarism, including the invasion of Iraq, invasion of Afghanistan, and also dismissed the notion to pay attention to the opinions of the Arab and Muslim streets. He says that they're irrational, which again gets us to Islam and Muslims being cast in this aspect relative to Orientalism and the work that comes out of it. More importantly, the clash of civilization and post-Cold War search for enemies gets us into the identification of Islam and Muslims as the new enemy next to China. And I will get a little bit to Samuel Huntington, Clash of Civilization, which is the thesis of Bernard Lewis that was made at least popular, even though that is completely, as Edward Said described it, clash of ignorance. But the fact that it's based on ignorance does not mean that political elites in the West did not embrace it. And specifically into the 90s and post 9/11, Clash of Civilization thesis of Huntington, as well as some of the work of The Arab Mind by Raphael Patai, became a must-read, which were, again, when you take a look at Abu Ghraib, the torture in Abu Ghraib, in Bagram Base, in Guantanamo, you actually have to connect it to these theoreticians that basically posited Muslim subhumanness and rationalize the whole regime of torture in there. One has to make those connections, including some who wrote actually supporting torture and also supporting internment of Muslims in America. And these are the individuals that have acted and continue to act with these Islamophobic Orientalist lenses. Now, when the United States have, as well as Western Europe, have embraced the war on terror, which is an open-ended war, but it was used to recraft hegemonic domination and expand the footprint. So the number of countries that the United States have conducted operation, the United States counter-terror war involves 39% of the world's countries, 7 countries that have air and drone airstrikes, 15 countries that have combat troops, 44 countries that have US military bases, and 58 training in counterterrorism, which includes also much of Africa that the United States have created a new central command in it under the rubric of fighting terrorism, but in essence is also to speak about countering China's or the rise of China. So the war on terror was built on the image and the threat of the Muslim subject. So Islam and Muslims were used as the folly for expanding US hegemonic penetration across the globe. Right-wing populism drives and feeds off Islamophobia. Global changes are taking place, the setting in of resentment politics, immigration and xenophobia, which we are seeing in Europe at this point with the replacement theory, social fragmentation, militarism and violence is posited as the solution, and then the role that mass media plays in commodifying Islamophobia. So that's also in linking Islamophobia to the setting in of right-wing political populism that have fed this dynamics. And right-wing populism drives Islamophobia in the media for votes. The role of the media is driving sensationalism and scandals focused on the Muslim subject. The Western media is a massive corporate entities. These are also invested in the military-industrial complex. So there is that relationship in there between one side of the corporate interest demonization that is also connected to militarism, promoting anti-government sentiments to counter regulations, specifically in the financial sector post 2008, 2009. So there is actually a deliberate effort in there. Politics and policy are theaters of entertainment. We no longer really have news per se, investigative news. We have entertainment that are packaged around news segments. Real experts are replaced with slick opinion makers or influencers. Your haircut is far more important than your opinion. And if you are funny, it's much more important than actually the content. And this actually also creates the dumbing down effect in terms of media coverage. And then social media is the landscape of populism, and it feeds on and is pushed through the Islamophobic content. Populism, electoral politics, and stoking white resentment through Islamophobia. Brexit was actually won on the back of Islamophobic discourses. And similarly, the election of Trump in 2016 is distinctively was driven by Islamophobia and packaging anti-Muslim sentiments and sending it to white electorate at the time, in particular, to drive them into the polls. Islamophobia and neutrality of the state in matters of religion. This is something that, in particular, in the France case, where and also Quebec in Canada, regulating the Muslim dress, in particular women. Now, in here, one have to understand, if we define racism as the ability to govern the body and space of racialized groups, then what is occurring in France and Quebec, as well as in other European states, is the racialization and racism toward Muslims by regulating their space and bodies, which goes back also to a question that I raised: does Europe have an Inquisition problem? Because during the Inquisition period, Muslim bodies and space were subject to regulation. A Muslim could not wear Muslim dress. Muslim space could not be maintained. So mosques were actually converted to churches or prohibited from being accessed. Muslim and Jews had to open their doors, and so they would not be engaged in any type of religious ceremony behind closed doors. They had to demonstrate breaking with the observation of halal and kosher publicly. So again, this neutrality is structured around the universality and normalization of Christianity as being the ideal, and therefore the Muslims as a minority are being asked to actually change and alter their bodies and space as far as what they dress to fulfill the requirement of a state that is structured around the normalization of and universalization of the Christian mode of conduct as a majoritarian in space and civil society space and the bodies of the individuals. Also defining identity through racism in terms of the whole debate in Switzerland, where the representation of the Muslim, you could see some of these images are so distinctively racist, with the use also of blackness, but yet these are states that are seen to be, quote, sophisticated, civilized, and I'm saying this with a condescending voice, yet the explicit racism in the advertisement should not escape anyone. But again, the restrictions of Muslims were adopted, and that shows us where the discourse, in particular in some of the Western European states, Switzerland, Austria, France, and Netherlands, among others, And problematizing in here also would be important for us, the problematizing of the Turkish presence in Europe, and in particular in Germany, the problematizing of the Turkish community with the rise of Bagheera in Germany has to be understood as part of this historical continuity in racist discourse. The ideological driving force, again, Huntington and Bernard Lewis is very important, which I want to get into some of the main important element in there. Now, Huntington in page 20, I think this is one of the most important windows to get us to understand why Islamophobia is used and is promoted. Huntington, page 20 of his Clash of Civilization, he says there can be no true friends without true enemies. Unless we hate what we are not, we cannot love what we are. So again, in order to actually arrive at a sense of self-love for Western society, and as far as Huntington is saying, that we need to identify an object of our hate. So in this sense, the purpose of the Clash of Civilization thesis is to locate and love ourselves as Western society by means of locating and hating what we are not, which for Huntington is represented by the Muslims and the Chinese. Now, I argue that this statement by Huntington in defense of Western civilization, which is as argued or assumed to be structured around the Judeo-Christian tradition, my argument that Huntington is actually putting the Christian theology on its head. Christian theology is structured around faith, love, and especially in terms of thinking about Jesus, to love thy enemy. In here, not only that it's a thesis of ignorance, it's literally a thesis that upends Christian theology. And I think the challenge that we need to challenge it both on the merits of this argument, but also in this notion of defending Christian history by using this framing. And I think this is one of the most important elements in the Clash of Civilization and why it rationalized the search for enemy. So targeting Islam and Muslims is a way to define politics, culture, economy, religion, and identity in the post-Cold War period by magnifying the differences and then transforming them into an existential threat in the mind of US and Western public. By this doing so, the forging of a fictitious sense of patriotic unity and purpose is possibly actualized. So the sense is that in the middle of fragmentation, this becomes the way to forge unity. Islamophobia becomes a foreign policy paradigm and reorient Western states' policies toward confronting the Islamic-Chinese alliance. Islamophobia becomes the tool needed for birthing the New World Order. So many are seeing about the New World Order, New World Order. The New World Order is actually structured around this Clash of Civilization thesis that has the Muslims in particular as the other, as the unwanted, the demonized, the object where policy have to go through to eliminate in order for birthing this New World Order. Understood correctly, Huntington Clash of Civilization thesis is a call to affirm the worldview of the West, or more accurately, the US, by drawing clear distinctions from the Islamic and Sinic civilization. Here, the Chinese, Muslim, and Islam subjects are instruments to forge an internal cohesion in the US that, in Huntington's mind, is missing at present and is needed to maintain and extend America's power and domination. And by doing so, in the West, you no longer actually look at the internal failures, the economic disorientation as a result of neoliberal economic modalities, the corruption that was pervasive in the banking industry and the financial industry, the toxic dumping that has occurred from companies and corporations. So all what you need is this Muslim figure. So if a bank fails, rather than asking about the bankers and the CEO, you try to find a Muslim and project on them. That is the problem. If your VW Volkswagen car is running into a problem, you open the hood to see if there is a Muslim in the engine. So everything it becomes that Muslims becomes the new monster incorporated. Through it, we project all the problems, and therefore you don't discuss the responsibilities of those who actually derail whatever Western model of statecraft and success that has been articulated over the period. So Islamophobia as a policy funnel becomes an ideological policy funnel through which international and domestic alliances and coalitions are formed, where participants use Islam and Muslims' subjectivities as a foil to array their varied political, economic, and military interests. All what you need to say, there's a Muslim threat, and everybody goes up to the races. All the forces produce materials to saturate political circles, media coverage, and public discourses to the exclusion or marginalization of voices that are not committed to this framing. So the case of Islamophobia is the same as the way that the anti-communist and Cold War period produced horizontal and vertical domestic and international alliances and forces committed to this policy. So Islamophobia is a new signpost for overt racism, which I maintain created a new rationale for more intense violent racism toward African Americans, Latinos, and minorities in general in the United States. In the United States in particular, you could actually also say they contribute to others. These are institutions that are funded in the millions to target the Muslim communities, both in here, funding some of the most vile Islamophobic personalities and institutions. In one study that we did jointly with CARE, over $157 million that were spent in the demonization of Islam and Muslims in Western society. So this is actually a structured and stoked Islamophobia with massive amount of resources deployed to demonize and create the Muslim others. How to counter Islamophobia, and hopefully we'll have some time for discussions. Defeating Islamophobia is a collective civil society responsibility. And I do think that the Muslim world, for the most part, has not engaged in the needed work to counter Islamophobia in a structured, systematic way. Second, we must expose and marginalize Islamophobic voices. Increasingly, some Islamophobes from the Western world are being invited also to Muslim majority states to come and give training on how to deal with Islam and Muslims and how to deal with political Islam. So there is actually things that we need to make sure that not only that these individuals are not given a stage, but a calamity if some parts of the Muslim world actually give them an ear. Society and the law must embrace Muslims as equals, and I think we need to insist on this, and we should challenge wherever it's possible this marginalization and otherization of Muslims. Know that Muslim women are the primary targets in research that we have done, and with US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, France, and other. Between 75 to 85% of all violent attacks, Islamophobic attacks, target Muslim women. Yet many of the women organizations, feminist organizations, do not actually come to the rescue or the solidarity with the Muslim women. The Afghan situation is an exception, but it's after the US withdrew rather than when the US was there where violence was committed against the Afghans. So again, this is very important for us to know. Build a new civil and human rights coalition that will counter not only racism and discrimination against Muslims, but also other marginalized communities, whether it's in Europe, United States, and other locations as well. Ignore and report Islamophobia online and amplify credible voices. I'm always hesitant where people actually amplify Islamophobic messages. And I think what we need is to report them and then to amplify sound work and sound credible voices. Develop a civil society rapid response team so it's not left to individuals or a small group to do the work. This needs a considerable commitment. Incubate funds and endowments to counter Islamophobia. So it's not actually limited in resources or limited in the personnel that is there. Defeating Islamophobia and countering violent extremism. There are many that are saying, well, there are some Muslims that do bad things, and therefore we need to deal with that. And that is the connected to countering Islamophobia. I think these two different phenomena have to be dealt with separately and not linked. Racism is racism. We don't link racism against a class or a group of people based on the actions and individuals, horrific as it may be. That linkage should not be used because methodologically is very, very problematic. And share and highlight sound research. So this is, again, some of the issues ways to counter Islamophobia. Now, lastly, for us in the West, we actually developed a reporting app because one of the challenges we face in the field is data is very limited. We needed to develop a systematic data in order for us to get reporting. So now we have an app, Islamophobia reporting app, where people can report. Now we have it in Arabic and English, but hopefully in the next iterations, we will be able to do that. It allows people to report. It said, if you don't report it, it didn't happen. Again, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears about it, nobody documented it, it really fall. So it's the same idea in order for us to actually have a set of data, and we're able to get this type of data to share with policymakers as well as advocates. And again, experience of Islamophobia, report your incident, your data will impact policy. This is a firm belief that we have in relation to what we are undertaking. And this is, again, the Arabic translation. So thank you for listening and thank you for the opportunity. Thanks, Dr. Feliz, and thanks, Bayezid, for the invitation discussions. And I'll take any and all your questions. So let me stop sharing in here.
Dr. Bazian, thank you so much actually for this wonderful and very informative lecture, which sort of helped us better understand this, link between Orientalism and Islamophobia. And also, the way you introduced with us the visuals, very illustrative visuals that sort of like helped us to understand what's really going on, and also helped us to create this mindset about some of the arguments and ideas that you are sort of trying to get across. And also your lecture was very instructive and enlightening. So I have taken a couple of notes, sort of like summaries that I would like to go over with you. Like, sure. It provided not only succinct definition of Islamophobia, but also provided background information, this historical information, like how Islamophobia sort of like started. It's not just in the aftermath of 9/11, but actually it goes back in history. And then you talked about crusading times and the Pope Pius's crusading the rhetoric, especially about the Seljuk Turks. It was like, trying to get these armies against the Muslim Turks and get rid of them out of Jerusalem. So these were very helpful explanations for us to see and better understand this background and the historical, let's say, endurance of this Orientalist and Islamophobic, let's say, attitudes towards the Muslim other, the Middle Eastern other. Like, it was Saracen other one time for it. It was Turk other, and there was this, Turks as a term was, used interchangeably, and it meant also the Muslims. And these are important, notions that we also need to know, as you have pointed out, to better understand the historical background about Islamophobia and Orientalism. And also, your lecture helped us understand how we can put Islamophobia in a broader global context. So it's not just, let's say, something that happened in the past, but it is still a continuing phenomena which sort of affects the security of people. It's not just, let's say, something that we can just ignore and say, okay, this is something that's happening, but in fact, it is affecting the daily lives of human beings. And one thing maybe that we need to pay specific attention to, and this is like from your lecture, we need to see this issue from a humane perspective. Like humanity is the thing that we need to think about, like the humanism that was developed in the Renaissance time period. And so especially, you know, your emphasis and your explanation helped us to sort of like see Islamophobia from, you know, this racism and race relations. So it's not just this lonely and isolated case, but in fact, it is a case of racism. And this is something that we also need to think about and to emphasize further. So this was for this very reason, this was very informative, Professor. And also, you know, given all these, you know, the ramifications of Orientalism and Islamophobic, you know, attitudes towards the Middle Eastern, especially women, and how women are, you know, used in this rhetoric as, you know, and becomes this target of Islamophobia because of the veiling and hijab and all this. This is also another important point that we need to think about in relation to Islamophobia. So, you know, given everything together, Professor, you have given us a lot to think about Islamophobia in the modern day context. You know, right now we are grappling with issues like forced mass migration. And, you know, in Turkey, we have more than 5 million Syrian refugees, and Europe has this, you know, xenophobic reaction. This is what they say: we don't want them, so Turkey, just keep them at your gates, you know, and because this is again a form of xenophobia related to race, and again a form of Islamophobia and Orientalism. And, you know, building of walls, as we see in Palestine and other parts, you have occupations and wars, and especially the link sort of like you created and helped us understand between this Orientalist language and rhetoric and neo-imperialistic practices, how this Islamophobic rhetoric, like this new enemy, the Muslim mother is a new enemy, and the barbarian, all right, we need to get rid of them. So this is very important for us to realize this, you know, historical background to this, let's say, Orientalist and Islamophobic rhetoric that is used as a justification, let's say, for, you know, going to other places and invading their lands, like saying at one point it was, in the 19th century, we are bringing civilization to you guys, and in the modern day context, we are bringing democracy to you. And we have seen what happened, you know, in the occupation that happened in the Middle East. All right, so it looks like, you know, in those parts that you have pointed out, we don't have any democracy, unfortunately. So, you know, it was very informative, so I cannot thank you enough. So actually, I have received some questions, and while, you know, at the end of the your presentation, actually, you have sort of like touched upon some of the questions that I have here, especially, you know, what should we do about this situation? What should we do as younger generations do about Islamophobia and to counter Islamophobic attitudes coming from the West towards the, you know, Muslim other? So you have already touched upon this, and you have, you know, talked about how, you know, certain, you know, platforms that you have created to address these problems. To, you know, one thing that you have also mentioned is to raise awareness and to talk about this Islamophobic attitudes and assumptions, so that this is going to be not something that people, you know, experience and ignore, but actually become the talk and emphasize. So this is an important point. So actually, this was one of my questions. And, you know, based on your lecture today and also your other, you know, works that I have read, so in all of your works, so you opposed the Islamophobic practice of associating Islam with terrorism, all right? So sort of like we have, unfortunately, we have this juxtaposition and the phrase that is used, again, in itself, Orientalist and Islamophobic, this Islamic terrorism, like, you know, putting these two words together, obviously this has certain connotations, negative connotations, and you oppose this, you know, a certain phrase and emphasize Islam as a religion which promotes peace, human dignity, coexistence, and tolerance. So as such, you object to any form of like radicalism, extremism, and terrorism. So my question, based on these explanations, would be: do you think this is a message well understood and appreciated by the American public or centers of power in the United States or other parts of the world?
Well, if we think that maybe the shifts in various administrations, maybe on the rhetorical, there might be some shifts in the rhetorical aspect. But as far as US hegemonic policy, there has not been any fundamental change in US hegemonic approach to domination, to continued expansion of US penetration in whether it's in the Middle East or in other regions across the world. In particular, here heavy emphasis and focus on Africa as we speak, and also we could say parts of the Middle East where oil, natural gas, and so on. So there is not fundamental change in that aspect. There is change in rhetoric. Let's say Trump versus Biden, there is a shift in there. But that shift in rhetoric should not get us to feel that there is a change of US hegemonic control and imperial discourse centered on still dealing with the Muslim as the threat. Just to give you the sense domestically in the United States, the study in 2009 by the FBI, their own Justice Department, said that the primary domestic threat in the United States comes from white supremacists, white militias, white nationalists. That's their own study. Yet the FBI and the security apparatus in the country was all focused on the Muslims, surveilling Muslims institutions, surveilling mosques, entrapment of Muslims, and so on. So even the research, facts, data that they produced, not me or anyone else, they're actually still acted in this Islamophobic focus on the Muslim, because it serves a whole host of other interests that are connected, both military-industrial complex interests, elite interests. We're just getting some of the data right now from Facebook and how Facebook actually allows and almost looks the other way when the demonization of the Muslim subject on Facebook occurs, while allowing both all those who demonize Muslims and want to use Islamophobia to drive political leverage and campaign, whether it's Robert Mercer with Cambridge Analytica or the Brexit. So we could see this as part of the cluster. I am always insisting that Muslim activities should be dealt as Muslim activities of individuals, no matter how horrific it is. And again, I am not a person that says all Muslims are good. No, we have the good, the bad, the ugly, and in the in-between. But we deal with the individuals as individuals rather than immediately, as soon as something happens, somebody says, pull the Quran, we need to look at chapter this and chapter that. And then they bring the whole team of Islamophobes to begin to give us theorization about the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, that he is this, and then begin to actually consider the scope of history in order to reproduce Islamophobic and hegemonic discourse relative to the Muslims. If association is to be made between a particular tradition and violence, I would argue then George Bush invasion of Iraq should be actually problematized. And why is he not held responsible and collectively asking the question? This is not what I do, but asking the question, the Christian world, what went wrong? Because again, since at least my study since 1979, close to 12 million Muslims have been killed through Western interventions and wars and conflict in the region. Yet the Muslims are always being thought of as the violent one, right? So again, these are tropes that we need to dispense with and challenge at every encounter, because the worst thing is for us to internalize this question and it begins to actually respond to the wrong question to begin with. 50% of the knowledge in the question. If the question is wrong, then the answer is wrong. So we have lost 100% of knowledge.
Yeah, Professor. Actually, these other two questions are sort of like interrelated, and we have already touched upon this. Maybe we can just elaborate further on these questions. So obviously, there is not an easy and quick answer to this question, but what can be done to solve this problem of Islamophobia? And in relation to this, so it's kind of like twisting things a little bit around in my second question, because sometimes we use Islamophobia and say, okay, so this is what they do. They misrepresent us. They have Islamophobic assumptions and attitudes. And we tend to say this and do nothing about this. All right. So as a professor, sometimes we have this, thing like blaming the West for everything that's, going wrong in our society and our failings. So what would be your advice to the younger generation to, like, let's say, challenge and to do something about these Islamophobia that we are experiencing in different shapes and forms in our daily lives?
Yeah. Again, I did highlight the 10 ways for us to address Islamophobia. But also let me say the following. The fact that we point to the West that it does something, it does something. It does actually interfere in the political affairs of the Middle East, just like it interferes in the political affairs of Latin America, as it interferes in the affairs of Africa, whether it's the United States or France, which never misses an opportunity to try to give us a civilizational lesson. But France continued to draw all of its resources from the Francophone countries. It is still pillaging today various parts of the Francophone. And that's why the Italian Prime Minister, I'm not remembering his name, he said France without the Francophone countries would be the 15th largest economy of the world. But because of its continued driving of the resources from the Francophone countries, now it's the 5th or 6th economy of the world. So again, the fact that we're pointing to Western discourse should not again get us to understand that, oh, you're blaming the West. There is a blame on the West, just as we have some old responsibility. And I would say one is you need to dispense with this notion that the West is coming to help you in doing anything. My advice is that develop your own understandings, your own methods, your own approach. Go back to your epistemology, go back to your ontological understanding, go back to your own rich history, a history that dates thousands of years. And you should be able to actually understand and lift yourself with an understanding this. Western domination, Western corporations, Western banking institutions, Western elites, their primary goal is to promote their own interests. You could say there's nothing wrong with this, but the fault for us is that we think that they're coming to help us move forward. Again, the evidence is overwhelming. Wherever Western corporations and Western interests came, it leads to the poverty of people and the countries that they're associated with. This is not me speaking. This is their own, what you call, research, and their own, what you call, some of the individual that leads in the development. So that's one aspect, is to actually go back to re-articulate your own priorities, your own lens, while accounting for Western continued pushing for their interests across. Second, this is a problem that requires collective effort. There's no one whiz that are going to be able to figure it out. We don't have what you call a new vaccine that could vaccinate you against Islamophobia, like we have possibly a vaccine against COVID. This requires for us a systematic engagement, collective effort. We do need to develop centers of research, centers of data, studies, and to try to actually assess the multiplicities of ways that needs to do. And in doing so, I think our Muslim communities that live in Europe and also North America, these are partners that we should actually collectively engage with them in order to find what are the best solutions. Sometimes some of the efforts gets to be wasteful, that we think doing X, Y, and Z without the appropriate research will provide results. I think everything should be carried out with research, with empirical data, with evidence, with tested methodology in order for us to confront Islamophobia. Islamophobia is causing death and destruction. Without Islamophobia, you would not have authorized or would not have the Western support for the destruction of Iraq. Without Islamophobia, you would not have the continued, I would say, demonization, the continued abandonment of the Syrians. Right? You have 5 million Syrians. Islamophobia is at the root of not thinking of Syrians as humans. Syrians have become a problem where you build sieges and walls, while every day there are Muslims and others that die in the Mediterranean. It was all crafted around developing Fortress Europe by problematizing the Syrians, and Turkey gets to be caught with 5 million refugees, Jordan with about 1 million, Lebanon with about 1 million. So all those Western countries that want to play political games, these games mean death and destructions for Muslims. And we need to understand this so we could begin to put accurately what are the responses that we need to put forth as we deal with the crisis.
Thank you so much, Professor. And actually, based on what you have just said, as a result of this Orientalist, Islamophobic, and neo-imperialistic policies, it's not that they are affected, the Western, locations of power, but it's actually affecting the lives of the Middle Eastern people, the Muslims. It's not just the Syrians, but it's also affecting the lives of the Turkish people, for instance, before this problem sort of like reaches the problem, as they call it, to the gates of Europe, let's say. All right, Professor, thank you so much for this wonderful and very informative and eye-opening talk and lecture. I have learned a lot, and I'm sure the audience has also learned a lot. And we appreciate your taking the time with us to give this lecture for us. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Tashakkur.